This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member and I encourage you to become one too. Membership is very reasonably priced. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. Please do take a look at the list, and if you like the look of any of them, order them for your library or for yourself. Some of the texts are even open access, meaning that they are free to read and download. And a very quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updating theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthews.com. Now, I first met today's guest years ago at a conference in the Netherlands, but our paths crossed again recently at the Mansep workshops in political theory in the UK, where we were both presenting at a workshop on utopian and dystopian visions of human-animal relationships. Dr Frauke Albersmeier is a research fellow in philosophy at Heinrich Heine University Düsseldorf. Her research concerns metaphilosophy and ethics, including animal ethics and theories of moral progress, and she's published a number of really interesting papers on speciesism and on animal rights theory. Today, we're going to talk about her 2022 paper, Popularizing Moral Philosophy by Acting as a Moral Expert, which was published open access in the philosophy journal Kriterion. I thought this would be an excellent opportunity to reflect on the role of animal ethicists and other animal studies scholars when they speak publicly, including, of course, speaking on podcasts like this one. Welcome to the podcast, Frauke.
Thank you very much for having me.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So it's, I guess, a combination of a scholar's and activist perspective. As it regards moral philosophy, it's a very peculiar thing about normative ethics and also applied ethics, and to a lesser extent maybe political philosophy, that professionally taking a moral view for reasons that you have pondered on as a moral philosopher has certain practical implications. So unless you don't think that moral reasons are universal and action guiding, so that what is wrong for you to do is wrong for others to do, and that something being wrong to do, identifying it as wrong to do, really should not be done. Unless you don't think that, then if you take a view like it's wrong to eat animals, that view in itself gives you an inherent reason to make others take that view too. So being a moral philosopher, in a sense, gives you a reason to also be an advocate of the views that you support for the reasons that you work on in your profession. So to make that view and the reasons for taking that view known more widely, that is to popularize it, and to make it practically relevant, so to make it believed and acted upon. So you have a reason to campaign for that. That's a peculiar thing about ethics, and it turns out it's at odds with an idea that occurs in the debate about moral expertise, and particularly the question of whether ethicists have moral expertise qua ethicists. And this idea is that because ethicists are not more likely to be right or about question of what is good to do, what is right to do, so these first order moral questions, the public role for the moral philosopher should be a more neutral one, should not be that of an advocate, but maybe that of an impartial teacher about his or her field. So there is a conflict about, or between different views about what the moral philosopher should do when he or she is acting publicly. So the question naturally arises if we as animal ethicists have reasons to popularize and campaign for our views, are we getting into conflicts with our professional role? And I was also further led to be interested in this topic because you encounter this preference for neutral expertise in other areas too. So from an activist perspective, I'm involved in a small organization for you German-speaking audience members. Its name is Achtung für Tiere, so attention and respect for animals. And we offer teaching materials and programs for schools about animal issues. We also organize an annual workshop for others who do work in schools to get animal ethics issues into schools. And those animal advocates that do the actual classroom work, that go into the schools, will tell you that they often experience they are met with reservations and suspicion just because they have an identifiable pro-animal view, whereas at the same time you can observe that animal users have access to schools relatively often. And it seems to be that it's perceived as if giving information about a practice that is part of the status quo is more readily seen as something that is neutral. And an opinion that challenges the status quo is more readily identified as an opinion than an opinion that is pro-status quo. So the sheer presence of an opinion, as opposed to supposedly a neutral way of presenting facts, can be viewed as problematic. So that's, to me, that's interesting. I think it overlooks the fact that the mere stating of what the status quo is like without questioning it can also be a very effective way of promoting it. Of course, the classroom situation is different, is a special case, but ultimately, I think even in that case, this request for a preference for neutral expertise is problematic. So anyway, it's another aspect that led me to think about this topic.
One of the things you mentioned in your answer there is this idea of moral expertise. And I think it's worth teasing that idea out and working out what we mean by that. So what is a moral expert and how does that differ from, say, an expert in moral philosophy?
Yeah, people will mean different things by moral expertise. I think what most will probably have in mind is in the debate and maybe when they start thinking about this is someone who is more likely right about moral issues, who gets things right, who has well justified, or you might even say correct, moral views, or makes the right moral judgment. Usually when we talk about expertise, there is also a social dimension to that. So we also associate with that deference to an expert. So we treat someone who we have identified as an expert as someone we can defer to, we can trust their opinion and should maybe adopt their opinion if we don't research the question ourselves. And usually that identification of experts comes with having systems in place to identify who is the relevant expert. And this is the problem with regard to moral expertise, because it seems that there is no such system in place, or it's at least very questionable whether the way we select people who should get chairs in practical philosophy or should be lecturers in ethics should be considered moral experts. They may be experts in philosophy, they know the topics, the branches of ethics, they know what is being discussed, what is not so relevant in the discussion anymore, and maybe what the prevailing opinion is. That doesn't seem to make it necessarily more likely that they are going to be right on these first order moral questions. So, and this is exactly one reason why people think that the moral philosopher in public should take a more neutral role. It's disbelief in this idea that expertise in ethics makes you a moral expert, makes you more likely to be right about moral questions. And it's a kind of epistemic modesty that's maybe behind this idea. The idea then would be animal ethicists and other ethicists are not more likely to get it right, and their individual views are therefore also not more deserving of being heard in the public and getting a public forum. And therefore, in their capacity as scholars, their default role should be that of a teacher or impartial informant. So should be to provide information or maybe use their philosophical skills in argumentation and guide maybe or moderate the discourse, be more of a moderator than really a participant in the discussion. And this view makes the role of the scholar and the advocate become really separate.
Now, I know this isn't quite the point of the article, but would it be fair to say that you believe that moral philosophers are moral experts, or at least they might be moral experts in certain narrow areas?
The article indeed does not rely on assuming either that animal ethicists are, or ethicists in general, are more likely to get things right or not. If you ask about my personal view, I think there is something to the idea that Peter Singer, who is, among others, who is, I think, more optimistic when it comes to more expertise in ethics, to his view that, well, at least in the division of labor, ethicists devote their time to sincerely, ideally at least, sincerely and honestly working on moral questions and searching for the best reasons for some view or another. So they devote their time and intellectual effort to evaluating reasons. And in that sense, in a very limited sense of what moral expertise could mean, I think we may even at least want to hope that they are moral experts, because if you deny that, on the other hand, that thinking about moral questions will make it more likely that you end up with justified views, then you also take a very revisionist view about what all of our moral deliberation is about, as we, or at least large parts of it, that we conduct in this fashion, giving each other reasons and questioning each other's position. So all of that seems to be in the service of getting to better justified views. And if you deny that, then that is more likely to be successful, then also much of our public moral discourse doesn't make so much sense. But I would, when it comes to deference to moral experts and deference to ethicists on moral views, I would be very hesitant.
Yes, that makes sense. So here's what I take to be the key problem you're addressing in the paper. Some people are really worried about philosophers acting as moral experts, regardless of whether or not they actually are moral experts. Use the example of opinion pieces in newspapers, which are exactly the sort of thing that lots of philosophers write. But we might also have worries about philosophers making certain kinds of statements on a podcast like this, which has a much less specialist audience than, say, the academic journal articles that we spend a lot of time writing. So I have two questions. What particular behaviour are these critics worried about? It's not appearing on podcasts as such that they're worried about. And why are they worried about it?
Yes, so much of the debate turns on appearance in or service in ethics committees, and then generalizes from there to some extent. And even there, I think you could take the view that giving an opinion and giving the reasons for an opinion is a valuable contribution, and the moral philosopher doesn't need to be the impartial moderator of that, of what the committee is doing. There are different things that you can be worried about. So if it's a more public forum, maybe a panel or an interview setting with different participants, or yet a different public forum, you can be worried about abusing the space you have been given as an academic for your academic credentials, and then advancing just one academic's view, yours, and not being an ambassador of the profession or of the state of the arts, if you will. Not being a partisan participant in that forum, and not giving credit to or fair representation to other views that might be equally justified. And there is also the worry that maybe behind this worry is just the simple fact that there is, of course, peer disagreement. There is disagreement among ethicists, and if you're also lucky to be picked to be in a public forum, then maybe you should be more generous with the attention that you give to other views.
Yes, I see exactly what you mean. In section 4 of the article, you actually discuss a public debate on the ethics of eating animals between the philosophers Friederike Schmitz, and I'm sure lots of listeners will be aware of her work, and Herwig Grimm. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about here, but one thing that stuck with me is something you said about how refusing to offer a professional judgment in these kinds of cases might actually stack the deck against animals and in favour of the status quo. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, the only way to get to critically evaluate and reevaluate the status quo is to get into the moral debate and not to refuse to offer a view on that, and rather take the role or purport to take the role of a referee or moderator of that discourse. So just as opinions that affirm the status quo is more likely not to be recognized as an opinion at all, not issuing any opinion is just a lost chance to get any evaluation of what is of the practices that animals are subjected to. And so it also, of course, if the opponent, if the other person is readily making the judgment that what is being done is wrong, and many of the members of the audience to whom the conversation is directed are involved in that wrong, then they're of course implicated in that by that judgment. And if you have then a participant in this conversation who refuses to make any judgments, they seem to be much more maybe likable and believable because they offer a way out of this implication.
Yes, I agree entirely. And I think that I'm not saying this is what Grimm is doing, by the way, but I think this ties to a rhetorical flourish that you sometimes see in debates about eating animals, but animal use more broadly, where people say, oh, we shouldn't be making judgments about this, and try to frame vegans or animal advocates, but also moral philosophers and ethicists more broadly, as kind of fussy moralizers who are telling people what to do. Whereas, of course, we all make moral judgments. And of course, there's moral judgments on both sides of the debate. Yet it's the vegans and it's the moral philosophers who are tarred with this brush of being moralizers.
Yes, they are portrayed as those who want to intrude into a private part of life. And yeah, what's suppressed there is the thought that this might not, after all, be such a private matter. I mean, that is also a chance for a moral philosopher to be not maybe an opinionated participant, but really be a teacher, and in the sense of drawing attention to the fact that, well, normally we treat moral judgments as being universal and we treat matters that have an impact on others as being the proper subject matter of moral judgments, and therefore it's odd that you consider this a private matter, and it's odd that you should think that if you choose not to eat animals, then I still get to. So, and you don't have anything on me. So there's a role for philosophical educator to step into and still do something that is critical for advancing the debate for animals.
Now, there do seem to be some limits to your argument. That is, cases in which it's not appropriate for philosophers to act as moral experts, and they should maybe engage in a different model of communicating ideas. So could you introduce us to those kinds of exceptions?
Yes, so I think there may be cases where something like the value neutrality concerns in the original value neutrality debate. So what people who have been concerned, or what the debate about value neutrality has been about, has changed over time. And originally, when it was discussed, for instance, by Max Weber, it was about the neutrality of the scholar in his role as or her role as a teacher. So Weber's concern was that as a teacher, you have basically students who are to some extent put at your mercy in the lecture hall, and that is no place to promote and advance certain views that might not be or are not based on your professional work, that are to some extent your private opinions and not backed by the reasons that you can give as a representative of your profession. And I think any situation that is still like that, I think there is a presumption that being an outspoken advocate, or at least being an advocate in a certain modes, is possibly harmful, or that there's not, these kinds of situations are not the place maybe to be an advocate first and then a scholar. Even Weber saw that this is not entirely avoidable, so he thought you should reduce your value judgment to a minimum when you teach, but you're probably going to make some now and then. And also that in the public realm, you are free, even as a professional lecturer, then of course to, when you leave the lecture hall, you are free to advance and promote your views however you like.
It's interesting that you make this distinction between professional and private views, because I think it can be sometimes quite hard to draw a line between them.
Yes, so I think it's important to find this line and to be somehow alert to this line for yourself, because when you are given a forum as a moral philosopher, there is a reasonable expectation by the audience that the views, if you choose to promote them, are at least going to be your professionally acquired, held, vetted views. And of course, from time to time, you will maybe touch upon an area that is not your area of expertise. And if you go on to elaborate on that, you should maybe make the audience aware of that and be respectful of that reasonable expectation that the moral philosopher who is speaking publicly will give the moral philosopher's views, and you will be hearing views that have reasons that have been worked out by a moral philosopher in her capacity as that ethical expert.
Now, before we come to our regular questions, I've got quite a tricky question for you, which speaks to, I think, another set of problems in this existing literature on moral expertise. Now, this podcast speaks to animal studies much more broadly than merely animal ethics. Do you think that there's a case for the idea that other scholars of animal studies could be moral experts, that is, not just moral philosophers, and that they could appropriately act as moral experts in the public domain?
So the arguments that I'm making in the paper do not really rely on this idea that moral philosophers are in fact moral experts. And still they are in a very particular position in one way, and that is that this inherent moral reason, this inherent moral command to go out there and popularize their view is a moral imperative in itself. And they have acquired these views about what and what not to do in your relation to non-human animals as moral philosophers, whereas in some other fields you may rather import the moral imperatives from animal ethics and not work them out in your respective fields. And so this peculiar situation of having this professional imperative to campaign for animals, but also reasons to do it in certain ways rather than others, and this whole problem of reservations about the moral philosopher as an advocate. It's a special thing about ethics, but I think that others, of course, will certainly feel the imperative to go out there and make the results of their work as they relate to animals known. I think the problem that the moral philosopher is facing when they decide to take more of an advocate's role in public is that they also unavoidably enter a room of really genuine potential for a conflict of duties, because the same reasons that give you the reasons to go out and popularize your views also give you reason to maybe not do that in your best capacity as a moral philosopher, to go beyond the means of your profession. If our public discourse was a wonderful marketplace of ideas where there's a fair competition among ideas and arguments, and where the best arguments will be the most compelling ones and will be the most likely to become action guiding for your audience, then there would be, I think, no tension and no problem. However, in reality, we're not just in the business of convincing others, but often of persuading them. So solid philosophical arguments may not be the most successful way in any given situation. Interestingly, you have a professionally acquired moral view. You should act towards animals in such and such ways. And you have a reason to promote that view, but that at the same time is a reason to maybe violate the norms of your profession in the promotion of that view, either by at least not using the means of your profession, stepping out of your area of expertise and using maybe the most persuasive language that you can think of, metaphors, and just not the best arguments that you have on your hand, but eventually also maybe using fallacies and ad hominem arguments, or as I describe it in the paper, pretend to be neutral and then not end up being so neutral after all. In any given situation, it might be prudent from an activist's or an advocate's perspective to not to lead maybe with your best argument, but with the most persuasive one. And then even though you may appear as a scholar and maybe given a forum as a scholar, you don't advocate your view as a scholar. And that's, I think, a problem. But I think it's not a necessary and not an unresolvable conflict. So if you want lasting changes in attitudes for the right reasons, then you also have reasons to ultimately base that on your best arguments and pointing out the weaknesses and gaps in your view and being honest and sincere and just intellectually honest. So, but this in itself is a strategic consideration. But you may also have principled reasons to resolve that conflict in favor of professional duties, just by reminding yourself of the parameters of that situation and what your audience is reasonably expecting from you, what your professional duties aren't. You might just say that out of respect for others and the special obligations of your profession. You should not rely on faulty reasoning, but promote the view that you think is important to promote for animals in the best way possible, as is to be measured by the standards of your profession.
Yes, really fascinating stuff, and I feel this tension deeply. Now, Frauke, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, I think that will have been Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. I don't really remember the situation of reading it, but it must have been it.
Yes, that's a very common answer, as I think you might know.
I thought so. It's not very original, but...
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, so the first published peer-reviewed paper was called In Defense of Extinctionism, and it appeared 2014 in the Ethics Forum. So it tries to say something in defense of abolitionism, or rather its extinctionist version as it is being attacked in Zoopolis. And I should rather say extinctionism, really, because I think abolitionism is something that Zoopolis also promotes.
Now, good. That's a conversation we could have for a very long time.
Some other time.
Yes, I think we'll come back to that another time. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
That's a really difficult question. I fear I might end up naming more than one. And I think maybe I should dodge that question a little bit and say that, so impact on a personal level, but really also on scholarly thinking, comes from activists, I would say. At least if I were to, find the one person who single-handedly had the most impact. So I would want to name my activist colleague, Astrid Reinke. She has, in fact, multiple academic backgrounds because she is a vet and has studied philosophy. And yes, she just has a big impact on my thinking about animals, so on the scholarship side of what I do, through our exchanges about humans' attitudes towards animals and the actual details of the situation that animals are in, and her experience with caring for animals from a vet's perspective and someone who has cared for animals for a long time, and what makes it difficult to really care very good for the animals who depend on you, and her experiences with educating humans in her activism for many years. So she has a very critical mindset, and also I think she's the person that comes closest to who I would think of when I was asked, do you know any moral saints? Because she's just so devoted and giving the work for animals her absolute all. So she's a moral exemplar in that way.
That's wonderful. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So in their role in the professional role as academics, I think the answer is probably simply do solid work, just be more methodologically correct, precise work, look for those best arguments for the right reasons for which we ultimately ought to change our relationship with non-human animals in certain ways, and go for the difficult open questions and reconsider conceived beliefs and go for the questions that are most worth asking. But I would also say that as an academic, you have a very limited audience in your capacity as an academic in academia. Also, very basic insights luckily don't require indulging in academic work. So what the most important insights you can have, I think, about the human, non-human animal relationship, people have them without ever engaging in academic work. And so we can also overestimate what academia can do for animals. But yeah, if you're not an academic 24/7, then I think maybe also do work outside academia for animals if you can.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Another difficult question, because it's really a question about what does everything that is wrong with the human non-human animal relationship come down to, what it all reduces to. I don't know. So maybe if we could overcome this human sense of entitlement towards non-human animals, I think that would do a lot. It would allow people to at least entertain the idea that something could be wrong with how we do things every day, and come to the realization really that what we do day to day constitutes conduct towards animals, because animals are so often not even on the radar of people when they go about their everyday business. Overcoming the sense of entitlement to doing things that you've been socialized to do a certain way, that would get us somewhere.
What are you working on next?
I'm currently working on a project about the maybe preconditions of interspecies justice, or rather maybe I should say the question of how animal rights theory can identify and justify the limits of human obligations towards non-human animals, because I think this is something that has very big relevance for making a convincing case for animals. When you try to convince people that animals have certain moral entitlements, and you're facing people who will be very reluctant to accepting these claims, they will be very quick to point out cases where even proponents of animal rights will say, okay, here we have difficulties upholding the view that we should be protecting the interests of animals. So what about all the small animals that we harm simply by moving around? What about the animals we must keep from eating our food? What about the fact that animals harm each other and we don't intervene? So these are old questions, but it has been a difficult question for animal rights theory. And I think there has been this need to distinguish between duties to animals that are not overly demanding, even though people might find them overly demanding right now, and then a realm in which even animal rights theorists don't want to require humans to keep or to make certain sacrifices for animals. And so this distinction and how it's been made recently is something that I'm working on at the moment. Recently, this line has been drawn by relying on the concept of the circumstances of justice, so conditions that are favorable to realizing justice, not dire circumstances, but circumstances in which we can more or less comfortably respect each other's rights. And I think there are certain problems with the way that this idea has been used, this idea from political philosophy, and I'm working on spelling out these difficulties and what they mean for our duties to animals.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm very sympathetic to that framing of the problem that you identify, because I think there are big problems at the foundation of animal rights theory, and we need to acknowledge them and we need to work out ways to come around them. How can people find out more about your work?
Well, yeah, via my institutional webpage at the Department of Philosophy at Heinrich Heine University, on Phil papers. I have to say I'm not big on social media, but I can be found online for sure. So if you really want to, you will find me.
Well, thanks so much, Frauke, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me again. My pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. And please do tell others about us and review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.